Hi, good morning, and today is the 1st of April 2021. Every week we like to do a webinar for our ZP Developer Zone, and as I say, today is the 1st of April 2021. Every week we like to do a webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members. This is rather that webinar. I appreciate today is there's quite a few public holidays around the world at the moment, so I know lots of people are on vacation, but we're still going to do the webinar. As I say, every week we do a 30-minute webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members, and we'll hopefully, I'll just go ahead now. Okay, so the ZP Developer Zone is extremely active. We do have now a lot of members, and every week we do a webinar, and in the webinar we're often we have a webinar every week. We have the ZP Developer Zone for our members, we have the Academy, we have collaborations with our members, and we also have a forum where we're also posting let's say jobs on the webinar as well. So the webinar is very active. And then from the forum, or from the forums on the webinar, on the ZP Developer Zone, we have questions and we do answers. So there's quite a discussion going on. And part of that sort of Q&A is really what this webinar is about as well. That we do have a kind of Q&A with everyone on the forum. Just want to put out some news there this week that ZP was involved in the publication of a paper this week in IEEE on flexible circuit boards for SARS-CoV-2 detection. So we were happy to be co-authors on that, and we've had sort of, we definitely at ZP have long-term collaborations with academia, and so it's kind of nice to be included in some of these papers. It's kind of relevant to today's webinar because we're going to discuss DNA today, and obviously this webinar is also about DNA. Oh, sorry, this paper is also about DNA. So I just want to put out some news as well that this week, as I say, today's webinar is going to involve some discussion on the detection of DNA. So it's probably it might be interesting to note that there's a technology out there called eSensor from a company called Genmark DX, and it's probably worth noting that Genmark DX, they have a DNA-based technology, or they detect DNA, they detect things like mutations for cystic fibrosis, and I think they've also added SARS-CoV-2 to their panel as well. And it's probably just worth noting that Roche bought them this week, or maybe last week, for 1.8 billion. So the reason I kind of put this up here is that at Zero and Peacock we talk about electrochemistry quite a lot. We talk about gold electrodes quite a bit. We talk about DNA quite a bit, and there are companies out there, who have commercialized this kind of technology, and so it's just kind of nice to know that that this technology does make it onto the market through great companies like this, and for the founders of this company to sell their business for 1.8 billion, that's quite an achievement. So yeah, what we talk about might sometimes seem academic and just purely scientific, but there is a real world application for the kind of technology that we discuss on this channel. So last week's forum, I just want to kind of highlight that. That was quite so on the ZP Developer Zone, we have this research forum where I ask people to list questions for the webinar. So last week we discussed lactate producing bacteria, and it was kind of interesting because we did a whole sort of webinar around this, and then during the live streaming webinar, some questions came up, and so we started discussing the detection of these bacteria actually in the vapor phase. I'll just put a link to that. And the reason I want to highlight that is because these webinars are not they're not a monologue, we're live streaming to YouTube at the same time. So if you've got any kind of comments, just put them into the chat, and we'll try and respond in real time. And last week, we were doing that. I was chatting away about, the detection of lactate producing bacteria, and then the original questioner said, well, what about if it's in the vapor phase? And then we sort of changed direction slightly and dealt with that. So this week, we have sort of two questions that came up on the developer zone. We had one from Saran saying, well, do you need to do PCR in order to do DNA detection? And the answer is you don't need to, but we'll have to discuss that in more detail. And then the other question that kind of came up on the ZP Developer Zone forum this week was the longevity of our microneedles, and I'll discuss that as well. So first of all, just to the DNA, it's probably worth saying that if you've been a member of the ZP Developer Zone since 2020, then you've probably seen that we've already done webinars about PCR and then the electrochemical detection of kind of PCR reactions. This week's question is actually more about DNA detection not doing PCR. I can understand why they don't want us to do PCR, because if you're trying to make a point of care device or an in-field device, you want to make it quite small and low cost. And PCR can be quite a complicated workflow, so it doesn't translate well to low cost devices. So I can see why people want to get away from doing PCR in the field. So the first answer to the question is, if you're trying to do global DNA detection, then I think that is doable. And then there's specific DNA detection, which I think is more difficult. So what I mean by that is, if we have a cell, it is possible to, and I found a paper on this, to do the, here what they've done is they've taken the cell and they've extracted the DNA. But what they're doing is they're really looking, and it's probably, I want to highlight this, they're looking at the global DNA in this cell. So that's the secret here, that, the original question was, can you do DNA detection without doing PCR? Well, in this paper, they could do the detection of DNA without doing PCR, because they were looking at the global, all the DNA in the cell. So if you're going to just look for, or you want to characterize all of the DNA in a cell, then you've got a fair amount of DNA versus all the background by macromolecules. So when I was first thinking about this question, I was thinking about signal versus noise. When you've got a lot of something and you've got a high signal for it, and therefore your signal versus noise is better. Of course, if you're just trying to detect a very small mutation, among all the DNA, so the question that's come from Phil Wong is, do you have experience of immobilizing aptamers on the working electrode? So we do have experience of immobilizing aptamers on the working electrode. We generally do it through self-assembled monolayers. So we use the question just came in on the chat. So we generally do it through aptamers with a thiol group, and the thiol group obviously bonds to the gold electrode. It's probably worth Googling forming a SAM layer on a gold electrode, Zimmer and Peacock. I know that search term, forming a gold electrode on a forming a SAM layer on a gold electrode, Zimmer and Peacock, should bring you to a page where we actually discuss forming self-assembled monolayers. So that self-assembled monolayer could be an aptamer. So the answer to your question is, at Zimmer and Peacock, we do a lot of these kind of assays where you have an antibody or an aptamer, something that can capture another molecule, and then we could do the detection of it. So the question was, can we detect DNA without doing PCR? And the answer is we can, especially if the DNA of interest is actually quite a lot of it in the cell. because then you can imagine, you know, I've got a lot of DNA, therefore a lot of signal, and it's bigger than my background signal. Now, what they've done in this paper as well is they've got an antibody that's binding to this sort of methylated DNA, and then they use an enzyme, glucose oxidase. So that an enzyme is a good way of amplifying. So what they're doing is this: is they're bonding to the methyl group through the antibody, and then on the other part of the antibody they have glucose oxidase. And glucose oxidase is really active, so they're just going to be creating essentially a lot of electrochemically active molecules. Here they show ruthenium. It didn't have to be ruthenium. It could have been things like osmium. It could have been iron. It could have just been hydrogen peroxide. But essentially, you know, they've got one binding event, but because they've bound the glucose oxidase onto the DNA, it's going to really amplify the signal. So there, I suppose it's worth saying, Isa is asking, is ZP considering to develop a product of an SP with multiple targets in the future? Yeah, I mean, essentially, we can do that. I'm going to come off topic slightly. Just want to show you something very quickly. If you go credit card, I'll do credit card microfluidics. Credit card microfluidics, Zimmer and Peacock. The quickest way for us to make a sensor that can do multiple analytes at any one time is to have this kind of form factor. This is basically a credit card where we've got a whole row of biosensors, and each sensor can be functionalized to the analyte of interest. So that's the easiest way of doing a multiple analytes from one sample. So it can be done that way. Now there's another way of doing it when you try and do the detection of all the analytes on one electrode, and that's a little bit tougher. There we are. This is good. This is a good point from Shirley. Shirley's saying that isothermal lamp amplification could be a better replacement for PCR. Can lamp-based detection be done? And the quick answer is, at Zimmer and Peacock, we do have programs at the moment where we're actually doing lamp-based DNA work. So we're not using PCR, we're doing lamp-based. So the quick answer to Shirley's question is yes, that can happen. Now I'm going to go back now, just remind us about so I'm making the point here that if you want to detect all the DNA in a cell, then you can do it PCR free. And a good strategy is bind to the methyl group using antibody, and then use that glucose oxidase, which is a really active enzyme, because it will just keep on generating, you know, more and more molecules and really amplify that binding event. So that's how they've managed to do a PCR-free DNA detection there, because they went after all the DNA in the cell. Now, I think that the real question was, and by the way, you can just do it on something like one of these gold electrodes from Zimmer and Peacock. Now, I think the question really was not, can we measure the global DNA without doing PCR? It's actually, can we measure specific DNA without doing PCR? And clearly, you know, I went away and had a good look at this, and obviously found relevant papers. Now, what I want to say about this is GenMark DX, at the beginning of this webinar, I said GenMark DX got bought by Roche this week for 1.8 billion. If you read their patents, essentially they're doing something similar to this, where they've got an electrode, and they've now in GenMark DX they are doing PCR, but once they've done the PCR, the way that they're detecting a single strand of DNA is they have an electrode, they have a capture probe, they capture the target probe, which is a single strand of DNA, which is this blue helix here, and then they bring in a reporter probe, which has a redox active molecule on it. So you have capture probe, and then you have target probe, and then they have reporter probe. So they essentially form this kind of complex on the electrode. And then they can detect whether the reporter molecule, or sorry, see this star here? They can detect whether that's present or not by cyclophotometry or by voltammetric methods. So it's a nice paper, and if you think whether these things work in the real world, it's definitely worth having a look at GenMark DX. They've proven that you can do this, and ultimately you sell that kind of business to Roche for 1.8 billion. Phil Wong is asking if the SPE can be used again after the detection. It's a good question. The electrode could be reused if you really wash it. If you want to, so you could just strip off all the macromolecules and reuse the gold electrode. I tend not to want to do that because every time you wash an electrode, you might end up damaging it or something. So you could reuse them. We try to make them at a price point where people don't have to reuse them, but that's why I really like a hyper value screen printed electrode, because at least they're 99 cents each, and so you can kind of use them once and throw them away and not risk that kind of cross contamination, but you can reuse electrodes. So the question was, can we detect DNA without doing PCR? Yes, if it's global DNA. I think that's quite easy. If it's specific DNA, it's harder now because you've got less of it against the background of all the other DNA in the system. But people have reported they can do it, and when I looked at the way they've done it, I thought, no, that does stand a good chance of being able to work. And if somebody said, well, that's just your opinion, I say, no, take a look at GenMark DX. This is the kind of way that they did things. Now, the question is, how do we avoid all this PCR? And so the one thing I realized, the weakness I found in this paper, and I'm going to ask you guys a question in a minute. The weakness in this paper was they were able to detect single-stranded DNA, but of course DNA mostly in the cell is double-stranded, and so I had a problem with that because I thought, well, in order to capture that DNA, you're going to have to turn the double strand into a single strand. So I went away and looked up papers, for how to open up the double-stranded DNA, and so far I haven't found a method where they're not using some sort of heat for the denaturation of the DNA. And I can understand that DNA is obviously held together by those hydrogen bonds, and there's a lot of hydrogen bonds along that double-stranded DNA, and that's quite strong. So I'd be quite curious, actually, that the questioner was asking, how do we avoid PCR? Now, the first stage of PCR is you obviously do, well, Shirley's actually raising the fact you can use other things like LAMP as well, but even with LAMP, you have an initial temperature rise and it denatures the DNA. And that's a problem for if you want to do a point of care device, because now you're going to have to include a heater into your design. And so I have gone around looking for the way of denaturing DNA, turning it into single strand, because once it's single strand, we can capture it then with a capture probe on something like a gold electrode, and then start the electrochemical detection. But even in this paper that I found, they're still using a heating step. So I suppose the question I might ask here is, if anyone knows how to denature double-stranded DNA to single-stranded DNA at room temperature, I might have to do a bit more research myself to kind of answer that question. So it was a tough question this week. The question was, could we do DNA detection without doing PCR? The answer is yes, especially if you're trying to detect, DNA that's essentially quite a lot of it in the cell. If it's more specific DNA, then I think there's going to be a signal to noise issue, and I am left with the problem that in the lab we can denature double-stranded DNA into single-stranded DNA just with a bit of heat. But I'm always thinking about, and people like Shirley will know this, that I'm always thinking about how to reduce lab work to disposable, low-cost devices, and so I don't like the heating step because it's going to put cost onto the onto any final device. But in the lab, you can do that quite readily. I'm going to change gears slightly now. I realize it's 8:19. so we meant to do these for 30 minutes. So I'm going to go a bit quicker. Right. I had one other question on the forum, or we had one other question on the forum this week, which was about our microneedles. Just for many of you, we don't talk about our microneedles too much, but these are the microneedles. We have arrays of little needles on this electrode. It's mounted on a PCB so we can make good electrical contact with it. So that will, those connectors there are the same as our normal SPEs, our normal screen printed electrodes. So people are interested in microneedles for doing sort of transdermal glucose monitoring would be a classic example of that. Now our microneedles, we've sold them and formulated them in for calcium and lactate, and then also for glucose as well. So they can be used for glucose sensing for what's called CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, which is interesting to see because you could see that at ZEP we do a lot of glucose monitoring, and that's why I liked one of the earlier papers when they were amplifying the DNA detection using glucose oxidase, because I know that enzyme really well. It's really robust. You can hit it with a hammer, you can heat it up, it carries on working. Anyway, we're using glucose oxidase here for the detection of glucose. So the question was, how reliable or how robust is your microneedles? And I think the question was probably more about maybe in the detection of glucose sensing. So I just want to show this data. This is data from day 13 to day 17, but we've been running these sensors for quite some time now. We have a program running in Norway. It's government funded for measuring the glucose in fish. And so we do have a lot of work going on in our laboratories about this. And this is just some of that data that you can see that we're testing it at quite low concentration here because I think it's more physiological relevant to fish. And there's breaks in the data here where we took the sensor back to 0 millimolar. What this data tells you is that glucose sensors in vitro are really quite robust. They will last a long time. Now you can see the drift in this sensor. You can see that my signal's drifted down from about 1 to 0.5. So I'm not denying that they're not drifting. And most sensors in a real application will drift. Now, that's why at ZP we have a strong data sciences group, because we know this, and you're going to have to compensate for this sometimes. And you have to, if you have a baseline adjustment, then you can compensate for it. So a bit of a strategy in life is, the sensor can never be 100% perfect, but you can make it 80% perfect. And then you have to fill in the rest of the 80% with things like, good mathematics, good data science. So these microneedles, we make them, we sell them, and they can be robust for over 2 weeks when they carry on working. I'm going to change just a little bit quicker now and just want to touch upon something called Sensit Smart. It is worth highlighting this technology. It is pretty cool. I mean, that it's a potentiostat that plugs into an Android phone. It gets its power from the Android phone. The software is on the Android. And then you can just put an SPE, a screen printed electrode, into that. The ZP ones plug into it. Just want to kind of highlight it because it is pretty cool. You can find them on our website if you're so interested. But I like it because, and if you want to see it in action, go to the ZP Academy and just search for Introduction to the Analysis of Orange Juice. And there's a video on the front page of that course where it shows us measuring ascorbic acid in orange juice using this potentiostat. It's definitely worth a look. I mean, if you're interested in this potentiostat, then kind of contact ZP, because what's really nice about it is it's pretty powerful. It's the lowest cost potentiostat I've ever seen. It's pretty cool. Now I want to go on to Djuli. So last week I ran out of time on Djuli, but I'm going to go a bit quicker this week on this. So Djuli is a cloud database, and I did ask the ZP Developer Zone members to sign up, and you guys, some of you did. So Djuli is a cloud system for the uploading, storage, and analysis of electrochemical data. You can, so the idea is you go into the lab, you gather your data on something like the Anapot system. If you're using a PalmSense system, you can also gather your data that way. And then you can upload your data to Djuli. You can register for Djuli for free, so please register for Djuli. And if you're a ZP Developer Zone member, just reach out to me, and there's a training course, and I'll send you a 100% discount code on that. Now, the Sensit, I am going to go back to Djuli in a minute, but I just want to say that the Sensit Smart, it works with some of our pH sensors, and so we've used it to gather pH data. And there's a video about that as well on our website as well, so it's probably worth just, I'll put the link here. I know it says ZP glucose sensors and Sensit Smart from PalmSense, but if you Google ZP pH sensors and Sensit Smart from PalmSense, you'll see the video there. So the Sensit Smart can gather pH data. The Anapot can gather pH data. Other PalmSense instruments, other PalmSense instruments can also gather pH data. So now I'm going to go to the Djuli demo itself. I haven't got that much time, but I will go to it now. So if you go to Knowledge Base, you click on Djuli. There's a quick introduction video here. There's a learning center here, and there's a login to Djuli here. Now I've already logged into Djuli. What I want to just do is say, just want to show you kind of how it works a little bit. So I've got a report. So I click through quickly. Now, luckily, this is going to be on YouTube afterwards. You can kind of follow me in slower then. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that there's some test data. You can download this test data. So you can go to our website, download the test data, and then that will allow you then, and I'm going to upload that test data now. So it's uploading the test data. So what's the point of Djuli? The point of Djuli is you can store your data online and in the cloud. You can analyze your data, you can share your data, and your data will be there. By the way, it's password protected clearly so that you can keep hold of your data. So here's the files. Now if I go to properties, this data type is continuous. So make sure that that's selected, and then I'm going to go to PC, potential continuous. I'm just going to click that raw data button there. So what it's done now is it's uploaded all the pH data, and it's presenting me the pH data. The next thing I'm just going to do this step by step. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fit the data. So now what it's asking me is to tell it about these steps. So each one of these steps, I need to make that 5. I'm double clicking here, by the way. Each one of these steps is a pH change. So I double click, and the first click tells me where to put it, and then the second click puts the mark in place. Next I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the, don't forget, you can open one of these accounts for free. The whole thing is free. The training will be free. Just reach out to us and get a code. I'm just going to remember something. Right. So I'm, let me just think, yeah. So 2, pH 2, pH 3, pH 4, pH 4. So I'm basically telling it at each time point what the pH was. 6, 7, 8. So you can see what I'm actually doing here is I've I got the data off our website, so you don't have to be able to, you didn't have to collect the data to get going with this. It just you can try it out for yourselves without doing that. What I've done now is I've uploaded four experiments. The software's brought the 4 experiments together and overlaid them. Then I'm doing fitting. So now I've told it, what the pH was and what the potential was. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask it to do a statistical evaluation. This is when it gets really powerful. It starts actually analyzing and doing statistical analysis on my data. Normally this would take Python skills, or it would take some really expensive software like Jump SAS, or some other data systems. But we're basically making a cloud system where you can store your electrochemical data, overlay your bring all your data together, and then do quite powerful analytics on your data. And then at the end of it, if you so wish, especially if you're kind of having to produce reports, you can then actually export the data as a PDF, which it's what it's doing now. So let me just say, so I did the Djuli demo. I did it quite quick. It's 8:31 now, so I realize that people are going to have to go in a minute. But register for Djuli, reach out to me, get a code for the course that goes with it. You can upload your data, analyze your data, and every week then we'll try and there's also feedback. You can give us feedback and we can start making Djuli even better. So summary for this week: thank you for being members of the ZP Developer Zone. I know it's a big a lot of people are going on vacation this week, so, or at least not in work, so thank you for coming. Thank you for the forum. I had some hard questions this week on the PCR, but I do appreciate it. Yeah, the question here, yeah, there's a good question. HiCam is asking, if he uploads his EIS data, can he then do fitting? The good answer is we definitely are doing an EIS module so that you can fit your data. So open your account, start getting used to it, and yes, there is definitely a module coming for doing EIS analysis. And as I say, everything is, the system is free, so you can help by using it. You can give us feedback. You can help us make it better. And yeah, please start using Djuli. And I just one last thing. And there's the report that spat out from Djuli. So you can see it, did quite a lot of analysis. And yes, we are going to add EIS modules to it as well. So in summary, I've gone 2 minutes over, but thank you very much. Appreciate the questions on the forum. If you still want me to dig in deeper on some of these questions, or you have new questions, post them on the forum. Otherwise, yeah, I wish you all a good rest of the day, and speak to you again next week. And so goodbye from London. All right, take care, guys. Appreciate all the questions on the chat this week. All right, thanks very much. Bye bye.